All right, I'm here with Benjamin Teitelbaum. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Duncan.
So you wrote a book recently, War for Eternity, which is a very epic title, and it largely deals with Steve Bannon and these far-right global power brokers. And you met with something like 20 hours of interviews with the guy. First off, did you have to delouse after talking to him? Physically, what was that like?
You know, at this point, I've been studying the far right for almost a decade, right? At the time that I'm writing this book, and virtually all of that research is face-to-face interviews. So I kind of crossed that bridge a long time ago, and it's not the sort of thing that affects me viscerally in the way that it once did. The thing that was new with Steve Bannon for me was that it was not just someone kind of on the ideological fringes, but also someone who in some way, shape, or form, currently or in the past, has had influence and, formal political power and influence. That was the strange part of it. That's what caught my attention more.
But not so much influence, or at least doesn't seem as he's past the peak of his influence. He's no longer in the White House, obviously. And over the past few years, he's been trying to sort of cobble together this sort of coalition of the right. Uh, how's that going? What is he up to these days?
You'd have to look at his projects, which number in the dozens, and I have access to a small number of them, and you'd have to conclude that virtually all of them have failed.
Right.
The reason I'm not as excited about that as some commentators is that has been his past always. If you look at his biography from the 90s, it has been one initiative after another, scores of projects, most of which fail, one or two of which succeed, and then become transformative for him personally and often for the causes that he's pursuing. So certainly I wouldn't want to myself relativize the importance of sitting on the National Security Council. Steve Bannon does not sit on the National Security Council anymore. Right. That mattered at the time. The fact that he's not there now matters, means that he has influence that's been lost. But again, I'm still not on board with the consensus and a lot of commentary that, okay, he's a failure. That's not why I wrote the book. I don't really care if he's a failure or not. But okay, he's a failure, and look at how pathetic he is now. The fight for control of the Republican Party in Congress, for example, that is playing out right now, where Liz Cheney, this anti-Trump congresswoman from Wyoming, daughter of Dick Cheney, has just been removed from her post. That fight that is taking place, and the likely successor, a congresswoman from New York State, who's coming to potentially replace Cheney, that has played out in Steve Bannon's channels. All right, when she was announcing her candidacy and her vision for the Republican Party, the channel that she chose to speak out through was Steve Bannon's podcast, War Room Pandemic.
Yeah.
Or calling it War Room now. So all of a sudden, after all of this catastrophic failure on his part, with him being, indicted and then pardoned by Trump in a very humbling manner in the wee hours of the Trump presidency, and how pathetic he looked, all of a sudden, these past couple of weeks, it seems that his media channels are newly relevant to at least internal Republican Party politics. I mention all that. I go off on that tangent to say I am absolutely not convinced that he is out of the picture for the future of the Republican Party or the conservative or right-wing movements in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading that book, Black Swan, recently, where one of the things he talks about is, if you're trying to bet on a black swan, bet on like a bunch of them that probably aren't going to work out. And
Yes.
you can look back, like Sarah Palin was someone who he wanted to use as a vehicle to run for president at one point. And then Donald Trump wound up being the lucky horse, I suppose. This is kind of an off the wall question. Why isn't he running as a candidate?
he's reportedly thought about it himself. Josh Green has reported that he's had a conversation with him about that. I never have myself. He's charismatic, let's admit.
Yes.
He can be a terrible speaker. There are times when I've heard him be kind of quick on his feet, but thinking about him in a debate, I'm not sure that he would work very well. And also, he has benefited. Part of his longevity has been due to the fact that he has not been the front person, right? It's been Palin, it's been Trump, and as his personal politics, as his social scandals churn and move forward, and none of it has ever really harmed him professionally, because he's not been in a position where scandal matters. So whether or not he aspires to be more than that, he hasn't said much about it. He's at the very least got a lot of reasons to thank not being a front figure, a public figure, in the same way that a politician would be. He's got a lot of reasons to thank that for his professional success, I think.
Okay. And one of the things that you go into in the book that I didn't realize really motivated this guy and other far right figures is this philosophy called traditionalism with a capital T. And you say at one point in the book, like, you talk about these sort of like pagan-esque, like, elements of the far right to your students, to show that these people aren't just like scary, but also profoundly weird. And can you describe what traditionalism is?
Yeah, so traditionalism is first and foremost a spiritual and religious teaching or practice or school. Initially, it did not have anything to do with politics. And it posits that millennia in the past, ages and ages ago, there was one true religion, the religion that got it all right. I don't know if you've seen the South Park, where they die and they go to something, they find out it's Mormonism. Oh no, Mormonism had it all right. The others were bastardizations. Well, traditionalism believed that in the past there was a true, authentic, enlightened religion. That's what the tradition is, capital T. But as ages passed, as time moved forward, it was gradually fractured, forgotten, misunderstood, and its teachings were scattered in imperfect form to a lot of different religious practices throughout the world. And where you find them today are principally in the mystical, let's say, esoteric branches of major world religions. So esoteric Islam, for example, Sufism, sometimes esoteric Christianity, sometimes esoteric Judaism, like the Kabbalah and things like that. But first and foremost, Hinduism. And the motivation, the justification for that is that Hinduism is so much older, and it's existed in unbroken practice much longer than other religions that are all kind of splinters from it. So traditionalists will look to all of those religions I just mentioned, often to Hinduism slightly more than the others, and try and piece together what this eternal, old, primordial truth was, this primordial tradition. And so that's kind of the big map of what it is. You haven't asked me, Duncan, what the content of it is. And that's where politics matter, is when they start talking about, okay, what was that tradition? What were the truths of the universe that were gradually forgotten, and why were they forgotten?
Okay, well then take that question and run with it.
Okay, so the teachings of it that ended up mattering most for politics are these. One of them has to do with time. The reason that the tradition was forgotten is because they believe that for essentially all of our existence, things are going to be getting worse. Time is equal to decline. Time is equal to destruction, and perversion, and forgetting, and things like that. They believe in cyclic rather than time. They reject the notion of progress outright. They think that this teaching was known to ancient mystics as well. This is part of what that old tradition was, and it also foretold its own demise. So they think that human society passes through a cycle of from a golden age to a silver age to a bronze age to a dark age, and then following a short cataclysmic event resets itself to a golden age whereafter things continue to cycle on and on and on. Compare that to a notion of progress or linear time, which is what we're most accustomed to thinking about in the West, in modernized society, and also if we're thinking through a Christian or Judeo-Christian mindset. That way of thinking suggests that as time goes forward, things improve. That we build upon our knowledge that we are gradually escaping a past of ignorance and oppression, and slowly working towards a better society. This is sort of the informal civic religion of America, for example.
Right.
So that's one thing is they reject time, time and progress really as being meaningful, and they're inherently conservative in that respect, that they think what is good is what has already been in the past, right, and what we can only hope to return to if we're lucky. So there's the time aspect. There's also a belief that what we might hope to return to features, among other things, rigid social boundaries. Through Hinduism, they'll often speak about caste hierarchy, and the sheer existence of separate castes in society that recognize each other as being fundamentally different and having different characteristics, qualities, and destinies. And that as time goes on, those borders break apart, and we see this ideal of egalitarianism and homogenization starting to come with this idea of progress, and we see boundaries breaking apart. Now, various traditionalists, especially as it starts to become more incorporated in the 1930s into politics, 1920s and 1930s and forward, they animate those basic ideas a little more than what I just was doing for you now. They say, yeah, it's not just caste hierarchies, not just an opposition between, let's say, spirituality and materialism, which is the way the Hindu caste system works, but they'll say, well, also boundaries between sexes. Ideally, men and women are purely distinct, and we recognize them as having not just different bodies, but different spirits and destinies and yearnings and visions, and society should recognize that. And that sets them up to really strike a contrast with feminism, which they see as not only trying to equalize opportunities, but also blend identities and destinies together. Separately, they can also see boundaries needing to exist in terms of ethnic or racial groups, and that it is a modernist perversion, a progressivist lie, to think that all people should be mixed together and that we are essentially the same. Something that underpins a multi-ethnic democracy. That concept. So we see those ideas. If I were to pause, or rather try and summarize all this, what traditionalists often on the right, political traditionalists today, they'll look at the world and they see a world where there is increasing globalization, an increasing irrelevance of national borders, social causes that are bringing together and equalizing men and women, and also racial integration. They see that coinciding with liberalism and secularism, and think that all of these things are part of the same process. They're all foretold in the teachings of this school, and they need to be opposed in some way.
Okay, there's a lot to go through there. One thing that just popped into mind is if they're talking about the loss of national borders, or them becoming more porous, why would a traditionalist who's hearkening back even thousands of years before the modern nation state was invented, why would they care about that?
Great question. And it's, for some traditionalists, nationalism itself is nothing to get excited about. Steve Bannon breaks from that mold, but some of the earlier political traditionalists opposed nationalism for the reason you just mentioned. They correctly saw nation states as modern phenomenon. Some further allege that, yeah, there are borders around nation states, but the prevailing ideology in most nationalisms is that, well, within the nation, we are all going to be equalized. All right, there are no more, no aristocracy, not a class system, but instead we are all going to be leveled as equal nationals. And there may be some domestic non-nationals, and that's a problem, but the ideology of nationalism really is to get rid of them, of course, and make sure that everybody is homogenized within the border. So as one pseudo-sympathetic commentator on this, Alain de Benoit, wrote, that really is just a sort of intermediary stage between, let's say, an older caste-based feudal system and global communism, let's say, in his mind, derisively speak in those terms. The nations were just kind of preparing the way for a global leveling, and that they shouldn't be celebrated. So there's a traditionalist ideologue who was once involved with Jobbik in Hungary, Tibor Baranyi, who in some way, shape, or form was rather a royalist than a nationalist. And that was just too out there and weird, even for his marginal party. So that was one problem he had. But that does let you know that for traditionalists, this is not a natural fit with nationalism.
It is kind of, I can see the opposition to the line of progress, where it seems like, at least among the liberal set, that the idea is a nation should become a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, and secular and democratic. And then at a certain point, you can reasonably ask, okay, well, if that's the goal of every nation, at a certain point, why do we even have nations? And so then one could mourn the loss of this nation. Is that kind of where maybe like the appeal to nationalism comes from? I'm just trying to understand it.
Oh, sure. You could, I mean, so forget about the critique I just said. One could also see nationalism as just, the first step in unraveling this broader process. I mean, someone could say that, well, we're already at a place right now where nation states, even once were engines of homogenization, now can function as tools to push back against a global equalizing. So yeah, it can certainly do that. And the idea that nations have borders, nations have histories that might be distinct from other nations in some way, all of that can appeal. It's just, we really would see the signature of a devout traditionalist if they started to go beyond that, if they started to really say, okay, well, nations are great, but we really want even deeper within the borders of a nation to start to see stratification and spirituality prioritized and things like that.
And I guess we should say this is still like a pretty obscure, I mean, influential, but relatively obscure philosophy, right? I mean, you go into the book how Steve Bannon like encountered this, and he was in like the ports of Hong Kong going to mystic bookshops on the edge of town. Like it's tough to get your hands on, right?
Especially in the realm of politics. If you have spent your life studying comparative religion and alternative spirituality, and you're in that world, you probably have encountered some traditionalist thinker, or if not that, a traditionalist idea, let's say. But you go into, Duncan, you just graduated from USC, right? If you go to a political science department at a school like that, or where I teach at the University of Colorado, and start talking to them about traditionalism or its foremost thinkers, no one will have a clue.
Yeah.
If someone does know in one of those settings, it has nothing to do with their status as political scientists or anything like that. And if you're wandering around Washington, if you're in the offices of congressional leaders and representatives, I doubt any of them or anyone on their staffs have ever heard about this either. If they have, again, it has to do with some exterior eccentric interest of theirs. This has had so little to do with politics, really, that, my book was kind of marketed as a Bannon book, but it's really about, this set of ideas that has not been in any position of power in politics suddenly gets there with some very volatile actors, right? But nonetheless, for being a set of ideas that never had any representation, that's what's more striking to me.
Yeah, and there are other, like, the characters in this book are, some of them are just wacky. Like Alexander Dugin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Uh-huh.
Um, okay, I had heard of him because he wrote some book called "The Foundations of Geopolitics," which I
Yeah.
haven't read it, but I've read like a summary of it, and it seems to be like a blueprint of Russian foreign policy under Putin. Um,
Yes.
First off, is that an accurate statement?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely. It was, prior to Putin arriving, the whole idea was how, forget about communism, but how as a state actor, how can Russia regain the influence that it had in the Soviet Union? How should it do it? How should it subvert its foes internally and globally on the global stage?
oh, okay. And who is this guy, Alexander? How did he come into a position of influence? I understand that that book is like being taught in certain like naval schools and stuff like that in Russia. And I mean, how did this
The
guy spring out of
military.
nowhere?
It's hard. It was. I'm not sure that his that particular book is being taught as much today, but it was definitely being taught at a critical period. I mean, the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. That crucial period in Russian political history. Who is Alexander Dugin? I get this question in interviews, and you'd think I'd be better at answering it, but it's very hard to respond. You could call him a philosopher. That might be aggrandizing in some ways. Some people would want to just call him a crazy person. He used to be a musician. He's very interested in theater. He's a publisher. He is a party leader at certain times, but you could also in the same breath call him a political operative. Some would want to even call him a diplomat, though if we call him a diplomat, he's of a very informal back channel kind of diplomat. He writes books, he gives speeches, he publishes, he forms organizations and parties, he protests, he shows up in areas of major military conflict and war zones in some cases, and agitates for Russia to push and be more aggressive than it might otherwise want to be. And then when we see him, one moment you see him doing something very goofy and silly. He appears in some unnoteworthy setting on television. The next moment, it turns out that he is a lead mediator in some multilateral set of negotiations between powerful state actors. That an example of the latter is after the shooting down of a Russian plane in Syria by Turkey's military in 2015. No one really quite knew the process by which those three countries came to an agreement and were able to temper their aggression toward each other. And it turns out that Alexander Dugin, this kooky philosopher, was the one who was serving as a mediator between those countries. So he's very difficult to characterize, but he's all of those things. I suppose I could keep rambling and give you examples,
Sure.
but as you start to try and account for who he is, you have to deal with contrasts of him doing some things that seem very unserious and other things that seem very serious.
And the strange thing is that him and Bannon have met and sort of, kind of, but not really, are like comrades in arms, where you go into what the meeting between them was like. Why did these two figures reach out to each other?
Well, can I back up a moment, Duncan, and just talk about why that's surprising to us?
Please, yes.
So when I say that Dugin agitates for Russian military intervention and writes philosophy and things like that, what he is doing in many cases is bringing together traditionalism, what we were just talking about, something that he identifies with, and a military geopolitical campaign for Russia. He believes that Russia and Eurasia are incubus of tradition. and traditional values, with the way we would casually speak of that in the United States, and also in this more eccentric way I've been talking about in this interview, that Russia could stand for an opposition to progress, for stasis, for localism, for difference, for segmentation, opposite globalism. That's what he thinks Russia could do, and for religion, opposite secularism. The opposite of all that is made incarnate in the United States in his mind. He sees that the United States in particular, but also Western Europe, are the avatars of modernity and the lie of progress and globalization. And so for virtually all of his campaign, all of his career, let's say, he has been trying to come up with ways for Russia to stop Western expansion in his mind. Push back against modernization, push back against liberalism in all of its guises, the free market, left-wing identity politics, all the things that the United States, Europe, Latin America put under the heading of liberalism. Alexander Dugin puts them all together and hates them all. And so this is a guy who is deeply anti-American, and yet, yes, 2018, he meets with Bannon. The two of them have been trying to meet for a while, and they get together because Bannon, well, they both know that they share an affiliation with and an interest in traditionalism. That's what unites them. But also Bannon wants to influence Dugin. So they get together in Rome, and Bannon makes a case to Dugin that his traditionalist-inspired geopolitics is wrong, got it backwards, and that really, if you wanted to prioritize roots, if you wanted to prioritize spirituality over materialism, secularism, and progress, what needed to happen was that Russia and the United States should form an alliance. They shouldn't form an alliance based on capitalism and the Declaration of Independence and universal human rights and all those things that we might think of as definitive of American identity. Instead, they should unite around their common Christianity, common roots in the Judeo-Christian world, and forget about democracy, capitalism, freedom of speech, and all of those secular Enlightenment values. That's the case that Bannon made, hoping also to see Dugin start agitating within Russia for a more pro-US approach to a newly reconceived United States in many ways, and to push back against China, to try and break the link between Russia and China, which Bannon thinks is wrong-headed and also dangerous to the United States.
And do we know if he was successful at all in making that case?
He was not. Dugin was very, and Dugin has spoken differently about the United States since that meeting. Dugin is more open to thinking of the United States as being something other than a sheerly modern liberal construction. And saying that, well, the United States might actually have something like an ethnic identity to it in the way that European nation states are thought to, in which he kind of sees as being more authentic and traditional. But he doesn't share, even as a traditionalist, forget about if we just kind of view things from their perspective. As a traditionalist, he didn't share Bannon's belief that people of the same religion ought to coalesce with one another, and thus that a traditionalist geopolitics, if there is such a thing, is a geopolitics where Christians come together or something like that. Rather, he wants to see unification among theocratic states and the most robustly religious and spiritual, opposite secular states. And which religion is in play, it doesn't matter to him. And more deeply, he also wants to see unification among those states that are less individualistic, that are more collective. And so in his mind, that points Russia not to the United States, not to Italy, not to other Christian nations ostensibly, but to a theocratic state like thinks as being a sort of thinks of as being a sort of ideal state. And then in his mind to China, which he sees as embodying a sort of anti-individualism and a subordination of individual freedom to the collective. They're represented by the strength of the Communist Party in the Chinese state. So that was not what Bannon was anticipating, and their conceptual frameworks were completely out of whack. And again, Dugin, I'm talking about all this from their perspective. This is not to take into consideration the possibility that traditionalism, all this talk of spirituality, is not just window dressing for some other agenda.
Let's explore that idea, because this traditionalism, even I would suspect most people don't know about it, and yet have been influenced by it, or are fans of, say, Trump, or fans of Putin, whomever. What is the animating force on a popular level, do you think?
Oh, I don't think that it has one. It doesn't have any aspirations to that either. If you went to a Trump rally and told Trump's ardent supporters that, hey, a lot of what's going on right now, this is really in accordance with the teachings of Sufism, I mean, they would. I don't want to start speaking in derogatory terms here. I have some of those words at the tips of my tongue, but they would at least not be enthusiastic about it. Right. And when a lot of the conversations I had with Bannon were they really portrayed traditionalism as being his secret motivation, right? A deeper motivation, and not the sort of thing that needs to be talked about. And it's almost as if populism, nationalism, xenophobia, let's say, racism, if we just want to go there, all those things are kind of the selling points, the public facade for this deeper, more esoteric, more confusing, but in his mind, more fundamental agenda and vision.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that when we talk about window dressing, for a traditionalist like Bannon or Dugin, the essence is the philosophy, and sort of like the appeals to the blood are the window dressing.
Yes, yeah, right. I mean, here's another way. We tend to always think that that a lot of the way that we speak, a lot of the things we do in our lives, are all ways to euphemize, to beautify racism, and that racism, let's say, is at the base of a lot of what we do. And hence the criticisms of people who talk about moving to a nice neighborhood, and things like that. But that's all coat top racism. In the case of populism, there's I think a more revealing critique that, if not blatant racism per se, then at least nativism and xenophobia have been tools for free market capitalists to retain their power in government. In other words, that you can't really run and win anymore an election on a platform of lower taxes and small government. That's just not as exciting and not as resonant as it used to be in the 80s and 90s. And so if those actors, big business, let's say, if they want to maintain their influence, they have to hide themselves in some other cause, and populism has been the cause for them to do that. So they get these populist leaders elected, and then when they're in power, there actually isn't that much protectionism. There's not that much border protection. Instead, it's they lower taxes, which is exactly what Trump did, of course. So in that case, you would see populism as being a facade for neoliberal, as my colleagues in the university love to say, for free market capitalist stuff. But for Bannon, in the closer conversations with him, he describes this spiritual mission as being the deeper thing, the thing that need not be, but probably also would not benefit from being advertised as what it is to a larger audience.
And You mentioned like early on in the book when you asked him, "Are you a traditionalist?" that he's like, "Okay, today's off the record." Would
Yes.
and for that reason he was hesitant.
Yes. Yeah, because he knew, I mean, he knew what I meant by traditionalist.
Yeah.
Uh, he didn't mean that he plays baseball with a wooden bat as opposed to a metal bat or something like that. He knew I meant capital T traditionalism, and he knows that he knew right then that, I probably knew about certain thinkers for whom all this talk about time cycles and hierarchy was explicitly racial, right? That a golden society, a golden era age is where you have a rigid caste hierarchy with Aryan men on the top, opposite non-Aryans. So that was his hesitation. Um, I think what scared him off the bat, but as time went on, also, when he eventually started to say, well, I'm a traditionalist in this sense, I'm a traditionalist in this sense, he also wanted to communicate to me that he had his own take on all this stuff, and that he kind of was picking and choosing from the original traditionalist teachings as he was putting together his own program.
And one of the things, there was a great segment where Bannon was on Bill Maher at one point, and Bill Maher is basically like saying, like, all you do is you take these empty vessels like Sarah Palin or Donald Trump, and you try to shove your ideas into them. And you mentioned the tax cuts earlier, and one of the things I wanted to ask you, is there any sense that he feels like he sort of lost control of these empty vessels, or that he's not he didn't achieve what he wanted to achieve in the White House?
Absolutely. I mean, he said as much to me. I don't think he wasn't happy about the tax cuts. I almost expect, when you hear him talk, you would almost expect him to have been more aggressive in opposing those tax cuts than he actually was. But he opposed them, and he failed. He might have just recognized that he didn't have support. But he also, where he is much more lucid in talking about the failures of Trump, is when he talks about Trump's lack of disruption to the political status quo. We think about all these, oh, Trump, he destroyed all these institutions, all these normative behaviors in Washington that are not always guarded by law, but are guarded by practice. And Bannon really wanted Trump to just go to town on all of them. He never really did it to the extent that Bannon hoped. So yeah, I mean, I think there's disappointment there. On the other hand, I don't think, if I were to ask him about it today, I doubt he would say, oh, all is lost. He would probably say, no, Trump was just the first step. Now we've opened up this new space, and boy, look what's happening inside the Republican Party. We're in the process of transforming things. We're going to make a Trumpian party, and the old Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney version of the party is dead forever. It's just a matter of time until we get somebody new in there.
And when we talk about his like odyssey into politics, he's talked about it, he sort of framed it as like his origin story is the crash of 2007, 2008, and the effect that this had on people like his father. And
Mm-hmm.
yet he was formerly an investment banker. Was he able to square that circle with you?
No,
Okay.
no. I mean, I've heard his other origin story is 9/11.
Sure. Yeah.
And then yet another origin story has to do with Jimmy Carter and his failings as a geopolitical actor. So no, I've heard all of those. I mean, I don't want us to make too much of that, because most of us will come up with origin stories for ourselves and our politics that fray under closer inspection. But no, that is not. Opposition to crony capitalism, big business, is not a consistent feature in his political career by any means. No.
And when we talk about like the global reach as well of this of what he's attempting, um, one of the states that I thought it was interesting, I was just in Turkey, and Bannon's kind of well known in Turkey because he said something like Erdogan is the most dangerous man in the world.
Yes.
Why would he say something like that when Erdogan seems like a strong nationalist, friend of Trump, etc.?
That's a good question. I don't know the particulars of that. Actually, I've never spoken to him about Turkey, and it's compelling because he's not that much of a hawk on Syria. He did not want us intervening in Syria. Does not, think that Bashar al-Assad had to be taken out, for example. And here you have Alexander Dugin really wanting to reach out to Turkey. You would think that Bannon might be interested in that, but he sees the a potential alliance between Turkey, Iran, China, and Russia as being really bad for the United States, as being strategically bad to see such a large part of Eurasia united in one political alliance. But none of that's a strategic opposition to Turkey. None of that actually explains the sort of moral, principled opposition to Erdogan, or Erdogan's party. So I don't know those particulars.
Fair enough. And what about a place like Brazil? Like, why does traditionalism or Bannon have an interest in Brazil?
So in Brazil, you saw a populist leader, very much stylizing himself in the mold of Trump, come to power, and and significantly for Bannon's purposes, started to push back against China. Its geopolitical goal was to break Brazil away from integration into the Chinese economy and Chinese trade, and to reintegrate itself into the United States, and push toward the West. So Bannon liked that aspect of it, aside from the stylistics of this President Bolsonaro. But things go quite a bit deeper in Brazil too. You had a figure, you still have a figure influencing Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's popular movement, who has affiliations with traditionalism. His name is Olavo de Carvalho. Happens to live in Virginia, not far from Bannon's hometown of Richmond, but has all of his political life playing out in Brazil. And so you had this other narrative going on there around the government. I can go into details in that story, but you not only had this opposition to China, but you had a deeper extra economic motivation for it among some members of the Bolsonaro team, which was that we need to be part of the West. We are culturally, religiously part of the West. And we need to align with the United States and with Europe, not so much for political economic reasons, but because of identity-based and cultural-based reasons. And the fact that there is a traditionalist ideas floating around there motivates all this. There was additionally some members of that government also talked to Bannon. This really excited him, about the idea that, well, Brazil is kind of an outsider latecomer to modernization and to progress, and to notions of progress. And for that very reason, perhaps Brazil has incubated, protected some older elements of Western society, an older Judeo-Christian essence that can be used as, to Renaissance and the rest of the Judeo-Christian world. So you have, in other words, you have some pretty tangible geopolitical, economic things going on, and then some of the exact opposites, some very airy, esoteric dreams and visions about cultural renaissance and reintegration, all with a traditionalist in the mix.
And I'm sort of going through some of the countries here, but I want to ask about India, and where Modi has like the BJP Hindu Nationalist Party that seems perfectly ripe for traditionalism. No?
Oh, certainly. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and populism too. I mean, I haven't heard of anyone in India who is actually specifically in dialogue with Bannon or Dugin about traditionalism and a traditionalist sub motivation to what's going on there. But certainly these actors are very enthusiastic about Hungary and India because of the populism on the surface of it.
And what about Israel? I mean, is there any way that um, Bannon or other Dugin, et cetera, like one of the questions going around right now is, okay, if you're a America First Trump Republican, how do you reconcile giving $30 billion in military and economic aid to Israel? Is that an open question among the traditionalist cohort?
Yeah. I mean, in Brazil, that's one of the areas, one of a handful of areas where Olavo de Carvalho is not really in concert with the rest of traditionalists around the world. Bannon as well, although I don't really know in his heart of hearts what he really how he feels about Israel. That's not to just speculate about his anti-Semitism, alleged anti-Semitism, but I don't see a really clear agenda from him. Alexandra Dugin has been quite hostile to Israel, and the critique that he offers of it is will sound much more familiar and fits into some established tropes of anti-Semitism, where he faults the country from the one hand, sometimes exhibiting a sort of ethno state in the way that he might like to see it, while at the same time perpetuating borderlessness and liberalism globally. So thus that Jews have nationalism for themselves, but they want everybody else to be a disintegrated, helpless mass.
I see.
And again, there's some pretty old roots to that particular discourse.
Right. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask going from there is like, what what are they like? What is the goal here? Like, I maybe this is like outside of the realm of what you'd feel comfortable talking about, but like psychologically, what is motivating these people?
Oh, we have to speculate. To
Right.
say that right off the bat, because you're asking me to read people's minds, but I do have, of course, it's something that I reflect upon and I ask myself about.
Yeah.
They, on the one hand, you could say that they are simple populist right-wing ideologues for whom the typical motivations and the typical narratives about what they're doing and why don't satisfy them, right, or unsatisfactory. And for that reason, they're searching for some other way to characterize what's going on. All right, just saying, they took our jobs, keep our border secured, we don't want any immigrants taking our jobs anymore. That kind of crudely materialistic way of thinking about politics and community just doesn't mean anything to them. So they want this supremely grand narrative. It's also aggrandizing to think that you yourself know the secrets of the cosmos and of history and the currents of time. There's something flattering about that. So all of that could be going on. They could also be sincere in this too. They could also see, see everything like what we were talking about before, see populism, nationalism, right-wing politics as merely useful tools for something, for a deeper agenda. Something that speaks in favor of that interpretation is actually Bannon's history. You talked about the fact that he's supposedly this anti-capitalist crusader who has worked for Goldman Sachs, and we don't see consistency in that aspect of his biography. We do see more consistency in his interest in alternative spirituality and in semi-reactionary religious trends. That is more consistent. It predates his participation in Republican Party politics. It predates his interest in media. It predates his time in the military. Everything that has been more consistent. So perhaps that speaks to some sincerity in all of this.
When you mentioned the fact that these people don't want to justify their like prior beliefs with something as crassly materialistic as like they took our jobs or what have you. It is There's a great quote from like an Orwell review of Mein Kampf where he talks about like socialists and capitalists basically said like I'm promising you a good time, and Hitler came and said I'm promising you like struggle, danger, and death, and people just leapt at his feet. Is there an element of that going on, you think?
I would have to hear more. That's a compelling reference you just make there. We haven't talked that much about the connotations of the time cycle in traditionalism, but the fact that it goes from golden to silver to bronze to dark, and then the belief is that there's a cataclysmic event, destruction, fire, that will reset you and carry you from an age of depravity and darkness into one of glory, and thus that sets us up, sets the participant, the believer, up to celebrate struggle, conflict, destruction, death, and all of those things. And I'm thinking aloud here, Duggan. That part of traditionalism is one that resonates a bit more and is perhaps a bit better suited to public presentation than others.
Mm.
The tear it all down narrative.
Yes. Yeah.
Trump the destroyer. That Bannon was kind of careful, and he went in between a couple times saying, well, Trump is a disruptor, and then other times he'd say destroyer, and as if disruptor was the euphemism and destroyer is what he really believed, but he didn't want to say it in public. I think a lot of people loved the idea of Trump as destroyer. People who hate the direction of social change, who hate the government, the federal state, that's a familiar discourse in the United States, and who love the idea of a battering ram. Take no thought for the morrow. No plans for really what will come in its place or what will replace the destroyed structure. But sheerly the plan for disruption was exciting. So yeah, there could be something to that.
We're almost at an hour here, so I want to I have two more questions. When you talk about like the destruction, that phase, do these people give much thought to climate change?
I haven't heard anyone talk about it.
Okay.
No. I mean, in Brazil, a lot of them are more explicit in saying they think it's complete nonsense. And they see it as a sort of sign of the times, a sign of our depravity, that in their mind, scientists are spreading lies. Scientists should be learning and teaching the truth about the natural world, but instead they're spreading lies, and global warming is one of those lies. That's something that you heard from Olavo and some of his acolytes in Brazil.
Because you'd think that would slot right in there,
An age of destruction. Yeah, it's interesting. I've had a conversation with Steve's brother about this, who more or less accepts some of the basics of climate change, even though I think he's critical of some. I can't remember the remark. I shouldn't try and quote him right now. Yeah, but you think that would play into a narrative of conflict, that we're living in an age of destruction and of cosmic forces beyond the ebb and flow of daily politics, but cosmic forces that mean to destroy the world that we're living in right now. Yeah, but the chips fall as they do, and that narrative is really possessed, I think, by not just the left, but also people who want to see sort of global actors working together in a multilateral sense, in a globalistic, border-breaking sense, to address the problem, and that's never going to fly.
That makes sense. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is, where is this going? Do you? I mean, we can't predict the future, but do you see this this traditionalism as having sort of the wave crested, or is it gathering energy?
Here's what would speak for the wave having crested: the fact that virtually all of the individuals who work with this, if we're talking about Dugin, the Brazilian guy, Olavo, Bannon, the figures in Europe I mentioned very briefly, Olavo's acolytes in Brazil, it has been professionally, formally, officially just complete and utter for them. Right?
Yeah.
They can't hold down a job. They lose their positions all the time. They're in all sorts of legal trouble. They have money trouble all the time. So that might relate to, in some way, their traditionalism and the fact that they are so idealistic that they will not subordinate themselves to practicality. And thus, that's going to make them, in some sense, ineffective professionals. So that could be the case. But if we don't think about this in terms of the people, we don't think about this as a story about Bannon and Dugin and Olavo, but instead do what so many of my colleagues don't want to do and treat ideas like real things. And we think about traditionalism's trajectory. I hesitate a little bit to think that this is all over and this was just a parenthetical historical moment that lasted a handful of years. Because we see some ideas that were the prerogative possession of the least enfranchised members of society for generations, it has to be said, for decades, throughout the 20th century. And then all of a sudden, almost at the same moment, at a time of political upheaval, suddenly figures who were interested in these ideas and associated and identified with them found themselves in positions of power. Could that broader story, could that whatever social forces were there that made these ideas appealing to these people, could those forces stay there? I think so. And in that case, we're talking about full throttle, full-throated rejection of liberal democracy, rejection of modernistic values, basic elemental modernistic values like progress, like equality. Are we at a stage of dissatisfaction with those ideas that even the most far-fetched alternatives will start to appeal? I think the answer could be yes. So that speaks in favor of it. But as to where it all goes, I don't know.
Benjamin, thank you for your time. Where can people get your book? Anywhere books are sold, I assume?
Any place books are sold.
And do you have a website that people can go to?
Yes, just my name, BenjaminTeitelbaum.com.
Alrighty. Great. I really enjoyed this, and have a great rest of your day.
A pleasure chatting with you, Duncan. Thank you so much.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.